good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can all see and hear us. I think just a very short introduction from myself this afternoon before we get into things. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jack Snelling. I am the Chief Sales Officer here at Godel Technologies and have the pleasure of playing a very minimal co-hosting role in what is the first in a series of data-related webinars that we'll be running over the course of the next few months. I suppose without further ado, before we get into things fully, we are going to be covering the concept of the intelligence layer today, and I'm joined by Jon Kitchen from Godel, who will be talking in great detail about that. So Jon, do you just want to introduce yourself to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So I'm Jon Kitchen. I head up our data pre-sales here at Godel, so essentially responsible for our data strategy and talking all things data, one of which is today.
Fantastic. Brilliant. So I suppose, look, without further ado, let's get into things, Jon. I think that, and I know you've got some slides that you share on the screen, so hopefully everyone can see those as well. But just to start off with a bit of a question around the intelligence layer, really, and why does it matter now? I think, we hear that, time and time again, that people have been building and investing in modern data platforms for years now. So why now, and why is this a hot topic now?
Yeah, it's probably twofold. So the first one, which it's one of the first things I'm going to cover, is just the way in which AI has changed how we as consumers of data have got different habits and different expectations of systems and how quickly things move. So that's one of the biggest components. But then the other, as you said, people have already invested in a modern data platform. But what we're starting to see is, and it's all over LinkedIn, is that people aren't making the most of data when it comes to AI. And there's a lot of people diving headfirst into the use of AI without really thinking about the underlying frameworks and the governance and things like the intelligence layer. I was reading an exec report from Databricks earlier this week, and one of the points that they made was that there's more AI activity than AI value, which is quite an interesting concept coming from one of the biggest vendors in sort of the data and AI space. That what they're seeing as well is that people are using AI, but not yet are they really getting the core value out of it. And that's kind of where this concept of the intelligence layer comes in, and I'll describe primarily why it's so important for bridging that gap between just a traditional data platform and being ready to use data for AI, whether that be self-serve or getting into the world of agentic AI. Good stuff. So what I'll do is I'll just move on and sort of cover off what we're going to talk about today. So like I said, what we're going to do is start off with those data consumer habits, how they've changed, why it matters, and sort of why it sets the scene for everything else, really. And then what I'll do is sort of talk through the potential problems or shortfalls with traditional BI in comparison to what we'd call AI native, and sort of where governance sits within that. Obviously, governance has always been a key component when talking about data and AI, but it doesn't meet all the requirements for this. And then what I'll go into is what is the actual intelligence layer itself. I'm going to talk about it a lot, but actually giving some context into what that is and why it matters. And then the latter sort of half of the session will be more focused on seeing it in action. So giving some examples from different industries, so financial services, manufacturing, and retail. And then what that actually starts to unlock for businesses. And then the final bit that I'll cover off is a bit of a quick self-assessment. And really the purpose of this is just a bit of a sense check in where you actually stand today in terms of being AI ready when it comes to data. So I appreciate there's a lot to cover. We'll probably aim to be on the sort of 40 to 45 minutes mark. We've not got a specific time assigned for Q&A, but if there are any burning questions, what I'd suggest is either put them in the chat or preferably reach out to myself or one of the team, and we'll be happy to have a sort of more detailed conversation around this and go into sort of further depth. So the first bit is, like I said, around the way that humans consume data has changed, and I think there's no denying that generative AI, personal AI, has changed the way that certainly I and most people operate on a day-to-day basis. The first being that I suppose when you think about the way that you used to try and find information, you'd search on Google, maybe click through the first 10 links, interpret that data, put your own spin on it, and get to that answer yourself. Now, that has changed with ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, Gemini. That our expectation is that if we search, we can get an answer immediately, but then query that, make sure it's right, ask another question. So what used to take, even if it was 10 minutes, now takes seconds. And then sort of following on from that, it's the same with even things like emails. So you've got Copilot or similar tools where that can read a thread of 40, 50, 10 emails, and it gives you a summary immediately. Now, a year ago, 2 years ago, that was sort of a wow factor. Now that's just become sort of the baseline expectation of the way in which we work. And then the final bit is just that sort of asking in plain English. The reality is nobody would ever write a SQL query or some sort of complex question into their phone to get an immediate answer. So what really the point of this is to say is that the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis outside of work, or even components with inside work, has fundamentally changed. But the reality is when you think about most data platforms, they haven't. So that traditional way of going through a reporting request and waiting potential weeks to get a report back is no longer sufficient for people's expectations and how they want to operate, which sort of leads me on to the point around the traditional BI model and how that has a blind spot. Now, what I'm not trying to say here is that the BI model is now redundant, that the reality is dashboards still have a major place in all businesses and the way that businesses operate. The good thing about dashboards and sort of the BI model is they're very good at answering an explicit question that can be shared to a bigger audience. So you might have a specific board report that's got 10 viewers and you know exactly what you're building it for and what the questions are. But when you think about sort of those more niche questions or business questions where you need an immediate answer, or you might need to drill further into that and ask more information, if you go through that traditional BI model, you have to raise a request, somebody has to interpret the data, build the dashboard. You might wait a couple of weeks to get it and it's not quite right. Or the next stage there is you need to drill further into it to start to understand the data. That's where right now the current BI model doesn't really meet those expectations. But what we're seeing with the big shift in the vendors is this shift towards what we call an AI native data, which is where you can actually get to the point where you can ask in plain English and receive an answer in seconds. That question can span multiple systems. So it's not just a case of querying one system, you query multiple to get a combined answer. And it also then starts to enable that agentic AI experience. So rather than just querying data, AI agents can act on that data and getting to the point where that data is governed and accurate enough for AI agents to act on the data is really key. And it's one of the things I'm going to discuss later on. And the other bit is that every answer is certified and traceable to source. Now, again, this is something that I'm going to come on to later on, but where we talk about a lot of regulated environments or even unregulated environments, that being able to be confident in the fact that AI is using data and giving you an answer so you can have an audit trail on that and make sure you're confident on where that data came from. So a lot of that sort of stems on the point of governance. And this is sort of one of the things that probably was at the forefront maybe 1 to 2 years ago when AI sort of came to the forefront, was fears around governance, and governance was everything that needed to be done to allow people to use AI. I suppose in the first instance, there was probably some horror stories around Copilot or other data platforms where people really hadn't thought about governance, and then all of a sudden somebody could find a spreadsheet with everybody's salaries, or the finance or HR system was ingested into a data platform and people could query it. That obviously exposed sensitive data. Just some examples. But governance is obviously key and one of the biggest components, and it delivers a lot. So the data quality frameworks, data quality rules, sensitivity classifications, that ownership and stewardship and the lineage. So again, this isn't to say that governance isn't required. It's one of the core components of actually being able to use this. But the reality is it's not everything. So governance needs to be there, but governance doesn't actually enable you to go ahead and do everything that I've been speaking about so far. So as you can see on that right hand side, what governance doesn't deliver is an actual understanding on what your data means to the business. It can't span through systems in one answer, in one query, and it can't reason about different relationships around the business, or again give those certified auditable answers without an analyst being involved. So you've got tools like Purview and Unity Catalog across Fabric and Databricks, which are very good from a governance perspective at the sensitivity and classification. Those tools are still very, very, very relevant and required for a platform. But again, there's the major gap, which is the intelligence layer that we've been obviously teeing up to speak about. So this is where I'll spend quite a lot of time actually discussing what the intelligence layer is and what it means. And probably the first thing to note and make apparent is that the intelligence layer isn't a product that you can buy. There's also different naming conventions that people might talk about when it comes to the intelligence layer. It could be, I've heard the term a data layer. I saw earlier the term semantic spine. There's different ways of phrasing this, but I think the intelligence layer is quite a good way of framing that sort of gap between data, governance, and AI, that this is actually what provides the intelligence on the data. Now, you'll see that semantic models there. Now, a semantic model is the one that is usually been built by most organizations that have made sort of the venture into a modern data platform. And again, this is one of the most critical components, because this is what allows you to have that one trusted source of truth. So what every consumer that comes in, whether that's from a Power BI report, a Copilot prompt, a dashboard, whatever tool it is that you're using for visualizations, they come in from the same data, and it's one sort of certified metric of the truth, which essentially starts to eliminate conflicting numbers. So the terminology that people might use, or the numbers that people might use, people might say, well, my spreadsheet says this, but the reality is the data says this. So the semantic model is obviously the key component when it comes to getting the data in a position where it's ready to be used. But what that is missing is probably one of the most important bits when you think about self-service and AI is, yes, you know what the number or the metric is, but you don't know what that actually means in theory, which leads me on to ontology, which is essentially the business meaning context. So AI will know that a customer, I'm going to use customer in this example, and I'll probably use it throughout quite a bit because it's the simplest way to sort of distill this down. But AI will know that customer is a column in a database, but it doesn't actually know that a customer across different applications could be a client, an account holder, has different terminology. It could be the same with a definition of risk. So what is a customer at risk? From a business perspective, you would have rules to say, well, if they've got a renewal within 90 days and they have a decline in spend, that means they're at risk. Traditionally in a database, you might just have a flag that says they're at risk. So when people start to query this to say, right, how many customers do we have at risk? It will know immediately what the customer is via your business definition, and it will know what risk is, again, via that business rule definition. So what this allows you to do is sort of take a technical step back from the data. This isn't a technical component, a technical feature. It's a business feature that allows you to apply business rules in plain language, so that when somebody comes in who really understands the business, understands what your terminology means, what it is you're trying to achieve, they can apply this to the data, or the top level of the data, and then every query, every agent, every answer from then on will actually reference this ontology. So that's what takes it from just retrieving a metric to actually retrieving something that a human without analytical skills or AI can understand. So the next component is knowledge graph. So things like a knowledge graph have been around for a while, but again, these services without each other can become a bit redundant. So a knowledge graph is great because what that can do is essentially map technically all of the connections between the data, all of the entities, and you can end up with tens of thousands of nodes all connected together, which is great. But again, without the ontology and the business knowledge, It's really hard to pinpoint from an AI perspective or a self-serve perspective what it is you're actually trying to achieve. And the reason that this is so important, again, is because, like I said, with the BI model versus the sort of AI native approach, is that most of these technical business questions typically are more detailed. They're not something that has already been answered in a dashboard. It's something that will span multiple systems and is very specific for a point in time, which is where the knowledge graph plus the ontology can turn something that could have been a 3-week analyst project into just a single query. And if you think about that, when you compound it with how many times that might happen across the business, it really turns into a valuable piece in terms of time saving. So obviously what we know at the moment is that businesses are under a lot of pressure to do either more with less or more with the same. And this isn't just from an engineering capacity, it's from a business perspective. So when you start to think about people around the business that are interacting with data, whether that be within source systems, within applications, within spreadsheets, when you actually start to say, well, this could take 10 minutes a day or half an hour a week, or probably even much more than that, when you start to bring this down to, well, these queries could be done within seconds, it becomes a massive business value add that you can save a lot of time across the business, not just from a technical data engineer or data analyst standpoint. So that's semantic model, ontology, and knowledge graph, which gets you to the point where you've got the defined data from an actual metrics perspective. It's the single source of truth. You've got the business meaning, so you know what the business actually is defining that data as, and you've got the knowledge graph, which pieces it all together. But probably one of the most important components, especially when you think about regulated environments again, is something like an orchestration layer. So it's quite a fancy way of describing it. But essentially, I'd say think of this as a traffic controller for every question that comes in. So when somebody asks a question or AI asks a question, what this would do is essentially route that through to these are the systems that we're looking at, which version of the data, how confident is the answer, and essentially would make that audit trail. So that's getting to the point where you've got real time and criticality on the questions. You've got logs of everything. So what this means is that when you ask a question of the data, or AI asks questions of the data, you've got one question in, one question out, one answer out, sorry, regardless of how many different systems are involved. So what that means is it put pieces together to make sure that you've got a consistent answer with the audit trail in the background. Jack, I can see you've crept onto my screen.
I have. I think thank you for that, Jon. I think it's really useful just to break down exactly what it is and the sort of 4 core components that build up that intelligence layer. I think much like anything, right? When there's a shift or a change to the way that people do things, typically the market is then quite crowded with different vendors and people that claim to be able to support or have solutions in areas that can help enable some of this and bring it to life. So what are the vendors doing in this space right now to enable the intelligence layer?
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. It's a good question. I think what we're seeing is that all of the top vendors in the data space are really starting to put focus on this. So every announcement and every release from all of the players, from Microsoft, Fabric, Databricks, Snowflake, AWS, Google BigQuery, they're all bringing in different components which can support this. So I think probably Fabric were the first ones with ontology and knowledge graphs, but AWS have AWS Context, there's Cortex within Snowflake. Databricks, again, was just said about reading the reports, is they've recently announced that they're putting a lot of investment into Genie ontology, which pieces together with their Genie 1 AI capability. So what we're seeing across the market is this has become the real big focus. So where there was previously a big focus in some more areas around like BI and again the visualizations and more technical components, because all of these vendors also have AI capabilities, what they're trying to make sure is that there's a seamless approach to using AI with data, and it sort of stems from these intelligence layer components.
Thank you, mate.
Stuff. Perfect. Right. So what I'll do is I'll just move on now in terms of what does this actually mean when it starts to get applied to different organizations and different industries. Now, I appreciate some of these might not be relevant to everybody on the call. So like I said, financial services, manufacturing and retail, but hopefully what this will start to make you think about is, would there be similar scenarios across your business where there might be similar asks to this, where it's a sort of a similar approach where a BI model might not quite fit the bill, but it would be very reactive and time consuming to work in that sort of way today. So again, none of these are particularly groundbreaking uses of tech, but like I said, with that sort of time saving and compounding effort that is put into producing reports, it becomes a massive win for some organizations and allows them to sort of operate differently and potentially change the way that they act and their business processes, whether that's generating more revenue or just looking at time saving or reducing risk. So the first example here is financial services, and called it the exposure problem. So essentially, if you've got a risk team that want to know the total exposure of a corporate group, so you'd look across their loan, trading position, insurance, what would typically happen here is that you might have reports sort of set separately for loans, trading, insurance. They might sit within an application itself. You might have already modeled them in your data platform, but the reality is there is no way of quickly asking this. And typically when questions like this come in, they can't go through that traditional BI model of, right, we'll put in a backlog and we'll wait a few weeks. So getting that full picture means 3 teams and waiting on 3 different answers to try and piece it together. But if you've got your data platform modeled correctly, ingested all of the data, built that semantic model and have ontology and a knowledge graph in place, what that means is the total exposure for that group can be produced in seconds rather than weeks. And I suppose the question of how is because what ontology does is it defines that a loan, the trading position and insurance policy can all be associated with a corporate group. So as it might stand now, all of those sit separately within, like I said, those different systems and different reporting methods, which means that you've got no connected way of piecing that together. I think the main thing to call out here as well is that, yes, this could be done without ontology and knowledge graphs, but it goes back to the point that you would need to have separate reporting and analytic processes for each of these methods. And it's always assuming that you will know what the questions around the business will be before they happen, which everybody will know is difficult. And if everybody knew what questions were going to crop up in business, I think businesses would probably be a lot more successful. So hopefully that all makes sense from a financial services perspective and how ontology would work in that perspective. From a manufacturing side, it might be a traceability problem. So the example here is looking at which suppliers feed components into products with defects and if there's any open contractual disputes there. So again, it's the same sort of process that there might either be some reporting or no reporting across sort of quality defects, the suppliers, which components they feed in, and whether there's contractual disputes separately. So what that would mean at the moment is maybe half a day of manual joins across procurement, quality, the legal system, which if it's a quick ask, could be difficult if you're going through sort of information like InfoSec, trying to actually get access to that data. So they're all the things to consider here. So by the time that answer arrives, you've already made a business decision because you can't wait for the report to be done. But if you were to have, again, this process in place of all the data modeled, all the data ingested and ontology and, well, the intelligence layer in place, what you can do quickly with that is identify, let's say, the 3 suppliers and one of them has an open dispute and you flag that within seconds. And again, the way that this is done is you've defined that a defect and a product and a contract can relate to each other. Without doing that, AI would never know. It would just see them as completely separate entities, and you would have to manually piece all this together. So what that can do when you talk about the knowledge graph is it holds the connections and it can trace the chain instantly across those different entities and data sources. And finally, for retail, and again, appreciate this is quite a similar sort of scenario, but it sort of gives a bit more context into how this might work more from an agentic perspective as well. So the example here is looking at the root cause. So the question here being which stores will run out of a fast moving product this week and which supplier delays behind it. So again, this is something that you might have thought about as part of your BI model and a report that you can produce and a potential dashboard. But this could be more of a reactive response to a new product that's come in or some supplier issues that you need to act quite quickly. So again, going back to that BI approach, it could take a long time to try and find the details and data, by which point all of the shelves are empty within those stores because you're not being able to act on it. So by having, again, all of this in place, what you can start to do is look at at-risk stores and the delayed shipments behind them being flagged automatically. So what that then means when you start to think about true agentic workflows is you could trigger something, whether that be fully autonomous or semi-autonomous, to actually send through to a team to actually handle that, get in touch with the suppliers, get in touch with the stores, and be more proactive in terms of the way that you operate, because you are confident that the data is accurate, that it's all correctly related, and that you've got that full picture of the live and real-time data. I think the main thing to point out as well is that all of this is talking about ontology and knowledge graphs, but the orchestration layer is there as well. This is the one that's routing all of those questions through and is the one that's keeping that full audit trail of this. And these are very regulated environments where you would need to make sure that you do have the answers. So if you act upon anything, whether that be from an auditing perspective or from a legal perspective, you've got the answer in terms of where the data come from and why you've acted in that way, which becomes more pressing in this final example where I talk about sort of autonomous workflows and agentic workflows. So hopefully that all makes sense in terms of the three examples. And like I said, hopefully it started to make you think about potentially some requests that you've had around the business for reports or last minute urgent requirements to explore data and how long it took and whether something like this could have actually solved that challenge. So I think this, a lot of this has probably been discussed, but it's probably worth just going back over to sort of bring it back down to what we've discussed today. So going back over, we've obviously covered the gaps in terms of human expectation around data, not just the way we operate from a business perspective, but more so around the data around the business. I think more so than ever, data is becoming a business process or a business consumable. What used to happen previously is that data was very isolated to departments. It became very much a case of, well, this is my data, this is my application. If you wanted to actually access that data, you'd have to go through sort of maybe a painstaking request process or have a good friend in that department. But what we're starting to see is that the reality is businesses, if they want to get the most out of AI and what they have today, is they need to exploit data properly. And it's not just from a technical perspective. So again, going back to data, it used to be very much an IT operational component. It was often sat underneath an IT practice, which it still might be today. But there's more business stakeholders involved and departmental stakeholders really trying to understand what they can get from the data as less focus is put onto potential applications. You might have all your applications in place now. It's right, we've got all of the data. What do we then do with it to really make the most out of it, whether it be from analytics, machine learning, or AI? Obviously, we've gone over the intelligence layer and what that is and how it works within different industries. So I suppose just to sort of finalize it and distill it down into what this can start to enable, if you get this all in place, is sort of looking at what it is and I suppose the main thing here is it's not just like a feature list. So the intelligence layer, like I said, isn't a product, but one of the main things that I've discussed is that plain language ask. It's such a simple concept, but it's the way that people operate today. So if you can allow people around the business to have access to the data, it means that they can operate in much more of an efficient way, but being confident that it's correct and accurate and doesn't need to go through a full analytical process. And then the next point is one that I've covered off quite a bit in terms of AI that acts, not just answers. So I've talked about those agentic workflows, but really getting to the point where you're confident that you're not just surfacing an insight, but it can take the next step. So it can flag a response, flag the risk or draft a response or trigger some sort of workflow. That's where it really starts to add value later down the line when you've thought about what business processes could be solved using autonomous agentic AI. Now, pace is obviously the key thing here. And I've talked about it a lot in terms of time saving, but pace isn't always a good thing when it becomes sloppy and things aren't governed. But obviously what we've discussed is that it is very governed, it is very accurate. So it means that you're much more fast, but not just smarter. And then obviously, as we've discussed around the semantic model, what this means is it's one answer everywhere, which is really key as you start to expose more data around the business, as I've explained sort of previously around this becoming more of a business requirement and a business process to use data. Having numbers that don't conflict becomes very, very pressing, because what you don't want to have to do as the data team is manage conflicting numbers or conflicting interests across people around the business. So by defining what the business data means, business rules means, then the data platform, making sure that you've mapped all the data together by the knowledge graph, you can be confident that whoever asks the data will get the same governed response. And then obviously the final point, which I've talked about a lot, but it's critical in those regulated environments, is every answer being traceable. So speed doesn't come at the cost of the auditability, I think is really a key point. So it's what actually makes it deployable and not just a nice, shiny, impressive demo, which is what we're seeing with a lot of AI at the moment, is it's getting to the point of pilot, but never actually becoming productionized because the trust in the data or the processes or the auditability just isn't really there. And like I said, and sort of Jack asked the question around what vendors are doing. I think this becomes really apparent around the intelligence layer that there's become a massive investment from the vendors in this area. So they know that as people scale into the use of AI, there needs to be this gap that is bridged around the intelligence layer, the data layer, the semantic spine, however it's referred to. But it becomes a really key process in that sort of adoption of self-serve agentic AI. So the final thing to do, like I said, is this self-assessment around where do you actually stand. Now, I think most organizations would probably answer yes to maybe one or two of these. But the reality is that is by no means a failure. I think it's just where sort of the industry and most organizations are at the moment. There might be some that answer yes to everything, which is brilliant, and you're in a really good position. But the reality is that this is a relatively new concept, and AI has sort of been adopted more from maybe an embedded perspective as opposed to an agentic and self-serve perspective. So what I'll do is I'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to read through them, and then I'll just go over them sort of briefly, just to cover off what those questions are and just sort of get to a final point of the webinar. Good stuff. Appreciate I said a couple of minutes, but I'll probably jumped the gun a little bit there. Hopefully everybody's either read them or reading through them. So I'll just start from the start. I won't read them off sort of word by word, but I suppose the first one is the data pulling the same answer regardless of which tool or which person asks, or could you get two different answers? I suppose if you are getting two different answers, that becomes a challenge, which obviously presses the need for this. Next one is, does your AI know about your business concepts? So what that actually means, or what is just what is the column name in that example? The next one is, can it cross 3, 4, 5, or even 2 systems without a data engineer being involved and having to write custom queries for that? And then the next one is, when you get an answer that comes back, can you trace where it came from and how confident the system was, or how confident can you be that the data was fresh at that time? And then the final one, which is really about the longevity of this, is if a metric definition changes today, does that update ever around the business, or will it carry the same definition until someone notices? That's probably one of the most critical in terms of people might face some of these challenges and pains that often businesses do shift, terminology changes, metrics and definitions change. If you've got tens, hundreds of reports, what that means is somebody has to go in retrospectively and change that, which can be quite a painstaking task. So I suppose just to finish that off, if you've answered no to sort of 3 or more of them, that really is the intelligence layer gap. And like I said at the start of this, what the difference is between AI that works and AI that doesn't work or doesn't work in the way that it's anticipated. So that's everything from myself. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time. Hopefully that's gives some useful context in terms of what the intelligence layer is, or what the data layer is, and why it matters when adopting a modern data platform. As Jack said, there's obviously going to be a series of webinars, and there's so much more to discuss. I think data quality being the obvious one, because if that's not in place, none of what we've talked about today probably holds up. I think that's a session in its own right. And as I said, if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or the team.